Welcome to our Kids Church video for the 14th of February. Today we're thinking about justice and fairness, and actually how as Christians we need to go beyond justice and beyond fairness when dealing with other people, especially people who are oppressed or who really need our help. I'm going to say a prayer and then we'll play a game together. Father, as we think about this subject, we pray that we will follow your teaching to treat others well, to do unto others as we would have them do unto us. And we pray, Lord, that we will not always be thinking about ourselves, but thinking about other people. Help us to be just and fair in all we do. Amen. So this is a quiz. I've done adults against children. So if you've got any of your family, your parents watching with you, you could have them answer the adult questions and you can answer the children questions, and there's some points available. So let's see how we get on. So here we go. Adults. Which Roman was in charge of cultivation in Syria at the time of Jesus' birth? Any ideas? Well, here is the answer. And it was Cyrenius, and that was 2 points. Children, I've got a tough one for you. Which book of the Bible tells us about God creating the world? Genesis or Daniel? Well, if you said Genesis, you won 2,000 points. Well done. I'm guessing you've taken the lead. So adults, what were the names of Abraham's brothers? Another really simple question. Any ideas? Well, they were Nahor and Haran. And I'm being very generous. You've got 3 points if you get that one right. Children, another tough one, I'm afraid. Who built an ark to survive the great flood? Was that Noah or Jonah? Remember, God gave him this instruction because of this flood that was coming to build this boat, this ark, that the animals could come on and be saved. And that was Noah, and that's worth 75,000 points. So well done if you got that one right. You could be on 77,000 points, children. Adults, who was Bernice? I'm sure in the Bible, who was Bernice? I'm sure you're all calling out the answer. Bernice, of course, was the king of Agrippa. That was so easy, I'm only going to give you 1 point. Children, who was born in Bethlehem, did many miracles, healed people, went on to die on the cross, and then be raised on the dead? Was that King Herod or was that Jesus? Well, I think you might have got that one. I'm guessing Jesus, of course, and that one is for 1,000,000 points. So well done if you got that one. So adults, where in the Bible are apples mentioned for the first time? Well, I'm convinced that you'll know it's in Proverbs 25. That was so easy, I'm only going to give you half a point. Children, your last question. Who was thrown into a den of lions, Daniel or Eve? Another tough one for the children. If you said Daniel, you have got 2,000,000 points. So, children, I reckon you could have had 2 million plus 1 million plus 750,000 plus 2,000. 3,752,000 points if you got that one, though your question's right. So I suspect you might have won. But was this fair? Thinking today about being fair, being just. Was that quiz fair? What was wrong with it? Well, I'm sure your adults, if they've played, your parents have said, no, of course it wasn't fair. Their questions were much harder. And the point system was totally random, totally unfair. Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. And as Christians, we're called to be fair and just, and even more than that as well. We'll think about that in a moment. First, we're going to have a look at a story of somebody who faced a really unfair situation, and we're going to see how God helped her manage this situation. So this is the story of Esther, and it's from the book of Esther in the Old Testament. The Persians and Medians had taken over much of what we now call the Middle East, and a good number of God's people were living in the Mede and Persian Empire. The ruler of this empire was a guy called King Xerxes, and he was married to Queen Vashti. And one day they were having a great feast, and he was just entertaining some friends and drinking and eating. And at the end of the feast, he asked, or actually told, because kings were like that in those days, he told Vashti, his queen, to dance for his friends. And she didn't want to. I mean, you can't blame her, can you? There's this group of men all watching her, and she didn't want to dance for them. And so she refused. And in those days, that just wasn't the done thing. You didn't refuse the king. And she was banished out of the empire. And this meant that the king wanted a new queen. Now, what he did actually was he organised kind of a beauty contest. He sent his servants into the land. And remember, this was a massive empire stretching all the way from North Africa to India. And he sent his servants to find the most beautiful girls in the empire, and they were all brought to the palace. And they lived there for 3 years. He didn't see them for 3 years, and they spent that time being made as beautiful as possible. You know, lots of makeup and hair treatment and the best clothes and perfumes. And then he called the girls to meet him, and from that he was going to choose one of them to be his new wife. And he chose this girl called Esther. Esther was actually a Jew, but King Xerxes didn't know that. He just thought she was very beautiful and kind, and he decided to make her the queen. Now, the prime minister of the empire was a guy called Haman, and he had a real hatred of God's people. He worshipped false gods and statues and just hated the Jews and God's people, who said that their God was the only true God. Remember, the God that the Jews worshipped is the same God that we worship today. And Haman just hated them. And he managed to trick the king into passing a law that said all the Jewish people had to leave the empire, had to abandon their homes, leave all their possessions behind, and leave the empire. And any that didn't, any that refused within a certain time period, it was about 10 months, they were going to be killed. It was as bad as that. And the king didn't really know what was going on. He trusted Haman, and so you can see here he put his imprint of his royal ring onto this law, and that meant that this statute was passed. And so the Jewish people were terrified, really. I mean, they didn't want to leave their land, but they didn't see another option. Remember, they've lived there for hundreds of years. Their friends were there, their possessions, their homes, and they were going to basically be refugees, leaving the land and hoping they could find somewhere else to live. But Mordecai went and saw Esther. Mordecai was actually Esther's cousin, and he was a Jew as well. And he said, well, can you do anything about this? Can you talk to the king? The problem was that it wasn't that straightforward, because no one was allowed to address the king, not even his wife, without him giving permission. And actually the penalty for speaking to the king without permission was death. So Esther had to come up with an idea for this unfair treatment of her people. And she threw a party. She threw a great banquet, invited all his friends, and it got him in a really good mood, and he was really pleased. And he said to Esther, you can have anything you want in the kingdom. Just imagine that for a second. You can have anything you want. Any riches, any wealth, royal palace just for yourself, anything you want. But what Esther really wanted was simply for her people to be treated fairly. So she told the king, he gave her permission to speak, to answer his question. And she said, Your Majesty, the one thing I want is for my people to be treated fairly. What do you mean? He said, why aren't your people treated fairly? And she told him about Haman and his plot to get rid of all the Jews. The king was horrified, actually, because Haman had really tricked him into this. And the king wanted a united empire. He didn't want this to happen. And so Haman was the one that ended up paying for his disobedience, paying for his plot to get rid of the Jews. And Esther had saved her people. And every year since then, the Jewish people hold a feast called Purim, where they remember what Esther had done and remember how this unfair treatment had been reversed because of the willingness of just one person, with God's help, to do the right thing. Esther did what she could to turn an unfair situation into something fairer. She brought justice to her people and actually saved them from having to flee the country or even being killed. Jesus tells us that the way we live needs to reflect our love for him. He says being a Christian is about loving God and loving our neighbour. And here's a couple of verses, a couple of quotes from Jesus. Jesus told us to do to others as we would have them do to us. And from the readings that we had this morning in church, if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Jesus is saying here that it's absolutely right to look for fairness and justice, but we can even go beyond that. We can even look to help people even more than perhaps they ask, to do even more for people than they expect. That's kind of what Esther did. Mordecai just asked Esther for a little help, just to talk to the king, but she went all out to help and save her people and to bring fairness. We're going to learn a verse from the Old Testament now, which is about how God calls us to live. So here is the memory verse, Isaiah chapter 1 verse 17. But I wanted you to have to do a bit of work to find out what the memory verse is. So can you break my code? I'm going to give you a few seconds. You can always pause the video as well if you want to see if you can work out what the key is to breaking this code. So I'm going to give you a little clue now. The clue is this is an alphabet code, an alphabet replacement code, and it's a 1-letter backwards code. So S becomes R, as R is 1 letter in front of S in the alphabet. J, well, what's 1 letter in front of J? Well, you work it out and see if you can find out what those mixed up words are. Again, pause the video if you would like, and maybe get a pencil and paper and see if you can break my code. So let's have a look at the solution. S becomes R, J becomes I, H becomes G, I becomes H, U becomes T. And the same is true for the other words. So what we get is learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Isaiah 1 verse 17. Would you like to say that with me? Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, plead the case of the widow. Isaiah 1 verse 17. And this is what this morning's been all about living as Jesus wants us to live, to ask the question, how do we treat others? What can we do to treat others well and better? And how can we go the extra mile to help others? How can we seek justice? How can we defend the oppressed? Well, we do that by loving God and loving our neighbour. And when we have the opportunity, just like Esther did, to find ways to help and to serve others. I'm going to pray, And then we're going to sing about this amazing love that God has, that is so wonderful, so big, that it just should impact every single part of our lives. Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for how it shows us the right way to live. Help us to live in a way that goes beyond fair, that puts others in front of ourselves. Amen. So this song is called Big and Wonderful, and it's the song that starts bigger than a burger. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you again soon.
Bit of guitar. Take hold of your burger.
God's love is bigger than a burger, it is bigger than a mouse, bigger than an elephant and bigger than a house, bigger than a bus and bigger than a tree, bigger than a mountain, bigger than the sea.
What about the cloud? What about the sky? What about the earth? What about the moon? What about the sun? What about the stars?
Is anything bigger than this big love? No. Big and wonderful, big and wonderful, big and wonderful, wonderful love. Big and wonderful, big and wonderful, big and wonderful love, love, love. God's love is bigger than a burger, it is bigger than a mouse, bigger than an elephant and bigger than a house, bigger than a bus and bigger than a tree, bigger than a mountain, bigger than the sea.
What about a cloud? What about the sky?